The city streets glistened under the weak glow of holiday lights strung between lampposts, their colors muted by the steady fall of snow. A sleek black limousine rolled slowly down the avenue, its polished surface reflecting the festive storefronts. Inside, the billionaire father, Richard Hale, loosened his tie, his mind still buzzing from the speeches, the handshakes, and the endless toasts at the charity gala he had just attended. Outside, families hurried with shopping bags, children's laughter ringing through the frosty air, but Richard hardly noticed, he was too preoccupied with his own thoughts. He had raised millions tonight for the city's homeless shelters, and yet, beneath the comfort of his wealth, there lingered a hollow ache he couldn't shake. As the car approached a quieter street, Richard's gaze drifted to the window. That's when he saw her. A thin figure, hunched beneath a flickering streetlight, wrapped in a blanket so tattered it seemed more whole than fabric. She sat on the frozen ground with her knees pulled close to her chest, a paper cup resting near her feet, untouched by the passers-by who hurried past her without a glance. Snow clung to her tangled hair, and though her face was shadowed, her eyes, dark, piercing, almost defiant, caught Richard's attention like a spark in the night. "Keep driving," his chauffeur muttered, glancing back. "We don't want to be late getting home." But Richard raised a hand. "Stop." The limousine eased to the curb. The chauffeur frowned, clearly confused, but Richard was already unfastening his seatbelt. He opened the door, the bitter cold rushing inside like a warning, but he stepped out anyway. The polished soles of his shoes crunched on the icy pavement as he approached the woman. She looked up sharply, suspicion flashing across her face. "Sir, you shouldn't," the chauffeur started, but Richard silenced him with a look. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring at her. He was a man used to dealing with politicians, investors, and CEOs, yet he found himself strangely nervous under the gaze of this woman who owned nothing. Her lips were chapped, her hands raw from the cold, but her back was straight, her pride unbroken. "Why are you out here?" Richard asked softly, his breath forming small clouds in the air. "On Christmas Eve, of all nights, shouldn't you be somewhere warm, with family?" The woman's eyes narrowed, she drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "Family," she repeated, her voice hoarse. "That's a luxury not everyone has." Her tone wasn't bitter, but matter of fact, cutting through the holiday cheer that filled the city. Something in her words hit Richard harder than any speech he'd heard at the gala. He shifted slightly, feeling the weight of his tailored coat, the absurdity of the wealth he carried against the backdrop of her empty paper cup. Snowflakes swirled between them, silent witnesses to an encounter neither had expected. For reasons he couldn't explain, Richard stayed rooted to the spot, his question lingering in the cold night air, waiting for an answer that might change both of their lives. The woman's answer lingered in the air, sharp and unshakable, and for a long moment Richard could only stare at her. The world around them continued in motion, cars sliding by, muffled laughter from bundled children pulling sleds across the slush, the jingle of a bell from a street corner Santa, but here, under the flickering streetlight, time seemed to stand still. Richard cleared his throat. "I didn't mean to offend you," he said gently. "I only wondered how someone like you ends up here." She let out a sound between a scoff and a laugh. "Someone like me?" she asked, her cracked lips twisting into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You mean someone who doesn't belong in your world? Or someone who used to?" Her words unsettled him. Richard, a man who could silence a boardroom with a single glance, found himself fumbling. "I didn't mean it like that," he muttered, pulling off one glove, his bare hand cold against the winter air. "I only..." She cut him off. "You want to know? Fine." She shifted against the cold ground, her voice steady though her body trembled. "I had a job, a small apartment, a son who thought I hung the moon. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours. Then my company downsized. At the same time, my landlord raised the rent. I tried to keep up, but debt piles faster than snow in this city. When I fell behind, the eviction notice came. My boy was taken in by my sister, who could barely manage on her own, and she gestured around her with a bitter flourish. I ended up here." Richard felt the sting of her story, each detail peeling back the comfortable distance he normally kept from suffering. He glanced at her thin shoes, soaked through from the snow, and at the way she kept her chin lifted even as her hands shook from the cold. "What about your son?" he asked quietly. Her eyes softened at the mention, though her jaw tightened. "He's 8, bright, curious, loves to draw. I told him this was temporary, that mommy would find a way back. But he doesn't understand why I can't be with him on Christmas." "He shouldn't have to understand." Her voice broke on the last word, though she quickly composed herself, blinking away the tears before they could fall. Richard's chest tightened. He thought of his own son, Daniel, who even now was waiting for him at home with hot cocoa and a stack of presents under a glittering tree. For years, Richard had justified his long hours and missed dinners as sacrifices made in the name of giving Daniel everything. But here was a mother who had lost everything, not for lack of love, but because the world had crushed her chances. You know, Richard said after a moment, his voice uncharacteristically soft, I spend more time at galas and offices than with my boy. I tell myself it's for him, but sometimes I wonder if he'd rather have less of everything and more of me. The woman looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time her gaze wasn't defensive or suspicious, it was understanding. Maybe he would, she said simply. And with those words, Richard felt the hollowness in his chest deepen, as though she had spoken aloud a truth he had spent years avoiding. The silence between them was heavy, carried by the swirling snowflakes and the faint hum of car tires on wet pavement. Richard had come out of his limousine intending only to satisfy a flicker of curiosity, yet here he stood, unable to leave. The woman's story gnawed at him, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was painfully ordinary, a reminder of how fragile even the strongest lives could become. You said this is temporary, Richard said at last, his voice steady, though something inside him trembled. Do you still believe that? The woman gave a weary shrug, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. What choice do I have? If I don't believe it, I stop moving. And if I stop moving, I disappear. The city forgets you fast when you've got nothing. Her words struck him like a hammer. For years, Richard had built his empire on deals, contracts, and numbers, abstract things that never bled. But looking at her, he realized the human cost behind every statistic his foundation recited at charity dinners. He suddenly hated the thought of driving away and leaving her here, as though her strength and pride were just another story he could file away and forget. You're right, Richard said finally. The city does forget, but I won't, she frowned, suspicion flashing across her face. What do you mean? He crouched slightly so their eyes were level, ignoring the snow dampening the knees of his tailored trousers. I don't want to give you charity, he said carefully. Charity is a bandage, it stops the bleeding for a moment, but it doesn't heal the wound. What I'm offering is a chance. A way forward. The woman studied him, her eyes narrowing. A chance? I run a foundation, Richard continued, his breath visible in the cold. We help families like yours, families on the edge of losing everything. But we need people who understand, people who've lived it, to reach others. I want you to work with me. Not as someone needing help, but as someone strong enough to give it. She let out a short, incredulous laugh. You want me, a woman who's been sleeping on sidewalks and eating whatever I can scrounge up? Yes, Richard said without hesitation. Because you haven't given up. You're still here. You still talk about your son's future like it's worth fighting for. That's not weakness, it's strength. Her mouth opened as though to argue, but no words came. Instead, her eyes shimmered with something raw and unguarded, hope she had long buried. And what if I fail? She whispered. Then you fail trying, Richard replied. But I don't think you will. I think you've already survived the hardest part. For the first time, her chin wavered, her pride bending just enough to let in the possibility of something better. She looked at him as though measuring the sincerity in his words, searching for the catch. But there was none, only a man who, for all his wealth and power, seemed to need this as much as she did. The woman finally exhaled, a shaky breath that seemed to release the weight of countless cold nights. What's your name? She asked quietly. Richard Hale, he said. She nodded slowly, as though committing it to memory. Then, Richard Hale, maybe I'll take that chance. And in that moment, beneath the flickering streetlight on Christmas Eve, something shifted, her future tilting toward possibility, and his heart learning, perhaps for the first time, the true purpose of his wealth. Snow still fell gently weeks later, but the city looked different to her now. No longer from the hard sidewalk where she once curled beneath a torn blanket, but from the tall windows of the community center that Richard's foundation ran. The warmth inside wrapped around her like an embrace she hadn't felt in years. She adjusted the sleeves of her new coat, secondhand, but clean and sturdy, and glanced at the reflection staring back from the glass. Her cheeks held color again. Her eyes no longer darted with suspicion, but steadied with purpose. She stood at the edge of the stage, the hum of chatter rising from the small crowd gathered for the foundation's Christmas program. Families filled the room, some who had once been homeless, others teetering on the edge. Children clutched cups of hot cocoa, their laughter bouncing off the decorated walls. The air smelled of cinnamon and pine. Are you ready? Richard's voice came gently from behind her. She turned. He wasn't in his tailored suit tonight but in a simple sweater, his son Daniel standing beside him holding a stack of wrapped gifts. There was something different about Richard too, softer, as though he had shed the weight of 1,000 unseen chains. I don't know, she admitted with a nervous laugh. I've never spoken in front of anyone before. You've already spoken the hardest truths, Richard said kindly. This is just sharing them with people who need to hear they're not alone. Daniel smiled up at her. You'll do great, he said, his youthful confidence disarming her more than any polished reassurance could. With a steadying breath, she stepped onto the small stage. The microphone crackled, and the room grew quiet. For a moment, fear gripped her. What if they saw her as nothing more than a woman who had failed, a mother who had lost everything? But then she spotted a little girl in the front row clutching her mother's hand, her coat clearly borrowed, her eyes wary. She remembered herself in that child, and suddenly the fear melted away. My name is Anna, she began, her voice carrying a tremor that soon found strength. Not long ago, I sat outside on nights like this, cold, alone, and invisible. I thought the world had forgotten me. But someone reminded me that strength doesn't come from what you have, it comes from holding on when you have nothing left. She paused, her eyes scanning the room. If you're here tonight, you're not forgotten. You matter, and you're stronger than you realize. The room erupted in gentle applause, some wiping away tears. Anna felt her throat tighten, but this time it wasn't from despair, it was from gratitude, from pride. Richard watched from the back, his hand resting lightly on Daniel's shoulder. The boy beamed, whispering, Dad, she's amazing. Richard's chest swelled with something richer than pride, the realization that giving money had never been enough. What changed lives were words, belief, and the courage to see worth where others turned away. When Anna stepped down from the stage, Richard met her eyes. No words were needed, both knew that Christmas Eve had bound their lives together, not by chance, but by choice. And as the snow fell outside, softer now, Anna no longer felt invisible. She felt seen, she felt alive, she felt free.